Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel, and in today's video we're going to review this recent HTMX article that was published on the htmx.org website, Why Gumroad Didn't Choose HTMX. So this article was written by Sahil Lavinja, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, and it is pretty recent, so it was published on September the 30th. And let's sort of read through the article, and then I'm going to share my thoughts related to this article. So first, at Gumroad, we recently embarked on a new project called Helper. As the CEO, I was initially quite optimistic about using HTMX for this project, even though some team members were less enthusiastic. My optimism stemmed from previous experiences with React, which often felt like overkill for our needs. I thought HTMX could be a good solution to keep our front end super light, and that is in fact the case. If you choose to build a web application with HTMX, it is going to lead to a much lighter front end. Now, that logic is going to be moved mostly to the backend, and that means that we are going to have a backend with a lot more logic necessary instead of putting all of that logic on the front end. So it is sort of a choice that we need to make. In this case, I usually prefer to keep the front end nowadays much lighter and push sort of all of the logic to the backend and let the backend just render either the entire HTML page on an initial load or subsequent requests and rendering sort of the partials only. In fact, I shared this sentiment with our team in Slack, and it seems like the CEO posted here a link to the HTMX website inside of their Slack account. And then initially it seemed promising, as one of our engineers at Gumroad eloquently put it. HTMX is officially a meme to make fun of how overcomplicated the JS landscape has gotten, much like Tailwind is just a different syntax for inline CSS. HTMX is a different syntax for inline JavaScript. And here I don't exactly agree with this point. More specifically here, the point of it being simply a meme thing, HTMX. And I think that HTMX has gotten this reputation because the creator of HTMX uses sort of memes online, especially on Twitter or X, to promote the tool, to promote HTMX. And this has gotten a lot of people thinking that HTMX itself is a meme, it is not a serious tool, which is not the case. And I also don't think that it is actually inline JavaScript, but it is rather an abstraction that helps us with common functionality that we have inside of a web application, like sending post requests, setting get requests, and then doing the common stuff that we do inside the web application. Also, let's say, for example, adding loading spinners, disabling a button when we make a request. So it sort of creates a nice abstraction over JavaScript, in fact, but only when it comes to these actions that we usually need to take inside of a web application. And it creates a, in my opinion, very nice abstraction over that, instead of us having to write all of that manually. But it gets out of the way when we actually want to use JavaScript inside of our web application to add client-side interactivity. So if at a point in our web application we want to start adding client-side interactions, so interactions that only happen on the client side, we are free to do so, and HTMX does not interfere with that at all. And I think because of that, it is a great tool. Continuing, however, unlike Tailwind, which has found its place in our toolkit, HTML didn't scale for our purposes and didn't lead to the best user experience for our customers, at least for our use case. And that is in fact correct. I think that for a lot of projects, and more specifically, and this is the important part, for a lot of teams, HTMX is not a good choice, because there are a lot of teams that are used to the model of using React on the client or using another framework on the client, and then having a lot of the logic there on the client, and then having sort of a API connected to that client. And we've been using this model for so long inside of the web development ecosystem. When I first started developing, I learned how to use React, I learned how to use Svelte and all of those front-end tools. And it also took me a while to sort of adjust my brain to using tools like HTMX, but in the end, I ended up being much more productive. So one example that I can give you is that at one of my previous jobs, we had two different web applications that I was working on. We had one that was already previously created before I got there, and it used React on the front end and Adonis.js on the back end. And then I also got to work on a different project that I got to start and choose all of the tools that I wanted to use. And I decided to go with Laravel and Livewire. And since I decided to go with Laravel and Livewire, I was much more productive than with the other project. The other project, although all of the patterns already existed and I could easily know exactly how to do stuff, I was much more slow when it came to implementing features. And on the other side, with Laravel and Livewire, I could use the Laravel and Livewire model, and when I needed a bit of JavaScript, I could simply introduce Alpine.js and call it a day, and it was a much simpler model, and I was able to be much more productive. Now here are the points why they decided not to go with HTMX. First, intuition and developer experience. While it would have been possible to do the right thing in HTMX, we found it much more intuitive and fun to get everything working with next.js. Now, I still think that this is sort of a preference of the web developer and not really something that is a minus point when it comes to the HTMX side. It is simply a preference. The development process felt natural with Next.js, whereas with HTMX it felt unnatural and forced. For example, when building complex forms with dynamic validation and conditional fields, we found ourselves writing convoluted server-side logic to handle what would be straightforward client-side operations in React. Now this ties into my previous point. Yes, if we decide to go with HTMX, if we decide to build a web application with HTMX, then we are going to need to send that logic somewhere. The logic doesn't just vanish, it doesn't just go away, but rather we need to move that logic to the backend. And I think that with time and with experience, as we, as a community, start building projects with HTMX and start building web applications with HTMX or other similar tools, like I said, Livewire or even LiveView, we start to sort of understand what those patterns are and we start to become better at them. And as a result, we become better at building web application and we avoid having to write what they explain here and what they described as writing convoluted server-side logic. Now, I think this might be a result of using HTMX directly. It can be, but in my opinion, it might also be a direct result of a team that's not used to this model. Again, this is simply a model. It is a way of doing things. It is simply a tool. And if the team doesn't have the knowledge on how to do this using this specific model, it can get a lot harder. Next, we have UX limitations. HTMX ended up pushing our app towards a Rails CRUD approach, which led to a really poor or at least boring and generic user experience by default. We found ourselves constantly fighting against this tendency, which was counterproductive. For instance, implementing a drag and drop interface for our workflow builder proved to be a significant challenge with HTMX, requiring workarounds that felt clunky compared to the smooth experience we could achieve with React libraries. And this point I totally agree with. I think if you want to build a web application that's very heavy on the UI, where you want to have a lot of interactions in the client, then I think it is a better choice to pick a front-end framework like React, Svelte, or Vue. And I think the difficulty they had with the drag and drop is also a result of the huge React ecosystem. React has a huge ecosystem of libraries that help us with these kinds of things, drag and drop functionality, with UI libraries, all of those kinds of things. And when it comes to the client-side interactivity, we already have all of the work done for us. Now, I think there's nowadays a push to build tools again with JavaScript in mind and then build the bindings for Svelte, for Vue, or for React. But for many years, there were a lot of developers just putting in work and working on tools that were specifically made for React. And there is, as a result, the ecosystem is much more powerful when it comes to the UI. But like I said, there are nowadays tools being built with JavaScript in mind. And then when those tools are built with JavaScript in mind, let's say a drag and drop library, then it is very easy to build the bindings for React, for example. But it is also very easy to grab that JavaScript functionality and attach it to an already existing HTMX web application. And when I say HTMX, it could also be a Livewire or a LiveView application. So as an example, recently I was playing around with LiveView and I wanted to implement also a drag and drop functionality. And I stumbled upon this library by the Atlassian team called Pragmatic Drag and Drop. And since this is more focused on the JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, let's say, side of things, in my case, since I was using LiveView, it was also very easy for me to simply import all of the things that I needed inside of the app.js file and then bind everything using the LiveView bindings way of doing things with JavaScript and the DOM. And I was able to implement all of the drag and drop functionality that I needed in what I would say was a much simpler way than I previously done in the past with, for example, React. And if I ever have to build something similar in the future, it will be much easier for me to do since I already understand what the patterns are and exactly what I should do to implement this functionality, which was a very simple reordering of a list and also the ability to move items between lists. Point number 3 is AI and tooling support. It's worth noting that AI tools are intimately familiar with Next.js and not so much with HTMX, due to the lack of open source training data. This is similar to the issue Rails faces, and while not a deal breaker, it did impact our development speed and the ease of finding solutions to problems. When we encountered issues, the wealth of resources available for React and Next.js made troubleshooting much faster. I agree with this point. I think since HTMX again doesn't have so much of a vast ecosystem and not so many web developers working with it, it is much harder to find information online, whether that's on Google or using an AI tool. So if a team of web developers is implementing a web application with HTMX and doesn't already have the vast knowledge of how to use that tool, then it becomes a deal breaker since they would need to have some way of searching how to do specific things with that tool, which again becomes much harder here in the case of HTMX. Point number 4 is scalability concerns. As our project grew in complexity, we found HTMX struggling to keep up with our needs. The simplicity that initially attracted us began to feel limiting as we tried to implement more sophisticated interactions and state management. For example, as we added features like real-time collaboration and complex data visualization, managing state across multiple components became increasingly difficult with HTMX's server-centric approach. I'm not really sure about this point, especially because it seems like it is not only one concern, but multiple different ones. So this here says scalability concerns, and then here it is also mentioned that they had problems as they added features like real-time collaboration and complex data visualization, and this seems to me more like a JavaScript and client-side state problem than really a scalability concern. And in this case, I again think that with the HTMX model, if a team of web developers doesn't have the experience of using this model, then this can be very complex. It can become much more complex than it has to be, since instead of always relying on a server-side state and then adding little bits of JavaScript all over our application, we can try to create an over-engineered solution, which then becomes much harder to scale, like the point says here. And I also think again that it is a result of the vast ecosystem that React already has. So building things like complex data visualization Dashboards might be much simpler with React since it already has all of the tools necessary to do so, but in the side of the vanilla JavaScript, we also have all of the tools necessary. So I don't really sort of agree with this point, and I don't really understand um, why they had exactly these scalability concerns. So I don't think that the point is clearly made here. But again, I think that it can be a result of simply a team not having the knowledge of how to use these tools and where to introduce JavaScript at certain points and how to work more specifically here with HTMX when trying to, for example, show a dashboard, update the data inside of dashboard, and so on and so on. And the final point is community and ecosystem. The React Next.js ecosystem is vast and mature, offering solutions to almost any problem we encounter. With HTMX, we often find ourselves reinventing the wheel or compromising on functionality. This became particularly evident when we needed to integrate third-party services and libraries, which often had React bindings but no HTMX equivalents. And again, with this point, I agree with the first half. The community and the ecosystem is vast and mature. The only thing that I don't agree is this part where it says that third-party services and library often had React bindings but no HTMX equivalents. And the fact of the matter is that these third-party services and libraries would never have bindings for HTMX per se. HTMX is only a tool for us to interact with the server and update the DOM with responses that come from the server. And if we want to integrate these third-party services and libraries, we need to use bindings for JavaScript, like the library that I just showed you on doing drag and drop from the Atlassian team. They created all of the JavaScript functionality that we need to use it, and then they created bindings for React, for Svelte, for Vue, and all other tools. And if you wanted to grab that library and use it with HTMX, there's no HTMX bindings equivalent. There is, in fact, a way of using that library with JavaScript, and then us as web developers can do that integration into our web application as we see fit. Ultimately, we ended up moving to React Next.js, which has been a really great fit for building the complex UX we've been looking for. We're happy with this decision for now. It's allowed us to move faster, create more engaging user experiences, and leverage a wealth of existing tools and libraries. This experience has reinforced a valuable lesson. While it's important to consider lightweight alternatives, it's equally crucial to choose technologies that can grow with your project and support your long-term vision. For Helper, React and Next.js have proven to be that choice. And I totally agree here, we should always pick the tools that are best for the job. And another point that I'm not sure if it will be made later in the article is that we should also always pick the tools that are best for a team, not only for the project that we want to build, but also based on the expertise of the team. If a team already has a lot of expertise and a lot of experience building web applications with this HTMX model, whether that's using directly HTMX or using other tools like Livewire, like I previously mentioned, or Phoenix Live View, then I think it is in fact best to pick them. But if not, if the team already has more experience with this way of doing things, with Next.js, with React or Svelte or Vue, then I think those tools are better for the job because, again, the team is the most important thing. If the team doesn't have that expertise, then it doesn't matter if the tool is quote-unquote simpler, because the team will make things complex as time goes, because there are no clear patterns on how to keep things simple, on how to manage all of our web application, and with all of that experience from the team, it becomes much simpler, even if the tools are quote-unquote more complex. Since we've moved there, we've been able to seriously upgrade our app's user experience for our core customers. 1. Drag and drop functionality. One of the key features of our workflow builder is the ability to reorder steps through drag and drop. While it's possible to implement drag and drop with HTMX, we found that the available solutions felt clunky and required significant custom JavaScript. In contrast, the React ecosystem offers libraries like React Beautiful DND that provide smooth, accessible drag and drop with minimal setup. And again, this is completely true. It is in fact much simpler to implement functionality like drag and drop with React, But again, there is never going to be libraries that provide this functionality for HTMX, but rather there is going to be libraries that provide the functionality for JavaScript. And that is the point here. The point is that HTMX gets out of the way when it comes to the client-side interactivity. We use HTMX to make requests to the backend and then update the DOM with the responses that come back from our backend. But HTMX doesn't provide any way or any libraries for us to do client-side interactivity when it comes to things where the state stays on the client and is completely managed on the client, like a drag and drop feature. 2. Complex state management. Each workflow step has its own set of configurations and conditional logic. As users edit these, we need to update the UI in real time to reflect changes and their implications on other steps. With HTMX, this would require numerous server round trips or complex client-side state management that goes against HTMX's server-centric philosophy. React state management solutions like useState or more advanced options like Redux made this much more straightforward. One point that I want to make here is that HTMX does not have a server-centric philosophy on our entire web application. HTMX only has a server-centric philosophy when the state is on the server. So if we have this kind of form that is described here with multiple steps, and we don't need any kind of data coming from the server, then it is completely fine to keep all of that state on the client, and only at the end, when we want to submit the form, submit that form and send it to our backend. But if that state doesn't have anything to do with the server, if the form doesn't have to, for example, fetch data from the server or have to do any kind of checking with the server, then it is completely fine to initially render a form and then start adjusting the state of the form as the user starts getting through the steps, and doing all of that with vanilla JavaScript or other tools like, for example, Alpine.js. And I think that this model can be much simpler because we have things that should live on the client and then we have things that should live on the server. Instead of, for example, having to duplicate server state on the client and then having to ensure that cache of our data is always in sync, I think all of those operations become much complex with time instead of having this nice separation between the client and the server. The third point is dynamic form generation. The configuration for each step type is different and can change based on user input. Generating these dynamic forms and handling their state was more intuitive with React's component model. With HTMX, we found ourselves writing more complex server-side logic to generate and validate these forms. And that is in fact the case. We still need to have that logic live somewhere. The validation can either occur on the client side or it can occur on the server side. Now, one of the points that I also want to make here is that usually we need to do all of that validation on the client, and then we still need to do some kind of validation on the server because we cannot simply trust the data that is coming from the client. So in that case, we end up even duplicating our logic when it comes to the validation. But it is in fact true that if we remove this thick client that we have and we want to make it a thin client, then that logic needs to go somewhere. Again, the logic doesn't simply disappear, it still needs to be somewhere. And that is usually the server. So this is a point that I completely understand. If the team of developers doesn't really want to have that much logic living on the server, maybe they are more familiar with these front-end tools and they prefer to work with them. The fourth point is real-time collaboration. While not visible in this screenshot, we implemented features allowing multiple users to edit a workflow simultaneously. Implementing this with WebSockets and React was relatively straightforward, whereas with HTMX it would have required more complex server-side logic and custom JavaScript to handle real-time updates. And I completely agree with this point. I think that it is much simpler to build real-time web applications using something like React than with HTMX. And one of the things that also popped up in my mind while I was reading this is if Live View would have been a nice solution for their team, because Live View is also a tool for us to not have to deal with so much of the JavaScript complexity when building web applications that are interactive, and at the same time it is very nice and it has a very simple API for us to do real-time updates inside of a web application. So if you're not familiar with it, I recommend that you check out. It is a similar tool to HTMX in the sense that it does not require JavaScript to do updates inside of the DOM, but rather it uses a WebSocket connection to do all of the interactivity between the client and the server. And I think it is also a very nice tool, and it could have been a very nice tool for their use case here. And the fifth point is performance optimization. As workflows grew larger and more complex, we needed fine-grained control over rendering optimizations. React's virtual DOM and hooks like useMemo and useCallback allowed us to optimize performance in ways that weren't as readily available or intuitive with HTMX. And this is completely true, again, if the team is not used to using HTMX as a tool to build web applications, then it can become much harder for things like performance optimizations to be done. And another point here is also that these things like useMemo and useCallback are in fact just tools to prevent problems that come from the React's virtual DOM itself, and they are not necessarily performance optimizations that we do on an application, but rather a performance optimization that is done on React itself to sort of fix the issues with React. And I even think that the React compiler is going to try to fix all of those issues without having to use hooks like useMemo and useCallback. And to complete, it's important to note that while these challenges are insurmountable with HTMX, we found that addressing them often led us away from HTMX's strengths and towards solutions that felt more natural in a JavaScript-heavy environment. This realization was a key factor in our decision to switch to React and Next.js. We acknowledge that HTMX may be a great fit for many projects, especially those with simpler interaction models or those built on top of existing server-rendered applications. And here I agree with part of this point. I agree that HTMX might be a great fit for web applications that already have a lot of logic on the backend, but I don't agree that HTMX will only be a good fit for web applications that have a low amount, let's say, of client-side interactions. And the reason for that is again because HTMX only takes care of making the request to the server and updating the DOM. And when we want to have client-side state, we look for tools that are in the JavaScript ecosystem and that work with vanilla JavaScript. So these are sort of two different things. We have HTMX that takes care of sort of our CRUD operations, if we want to think of it like that. And then we have these JavaScript tools that we can bolt onto our web application and allow us to have more client-side interactions inside of our web application. Our experience doesn't invalidate the benefits others have found in HTMX. The key is understanding your project's specific needs and choosing the tool that best aligns with those requirements. In our case, the complex, stateful nature of Helper's interface made React and Next.js a better fit. However, we continue to appreciate HTMX's approach and may consider it for a future project where its strengths align better with our needs. And again, I'm going to reiterate this point because it is very important. Even more than HTMX being a good fit or not for a particular project, it is very important to think about what the experience of the team is. And I'm not going to assume that this team has more experience with React than with other tools like HTMX, but to me it seems like it. It seems like the problem here was more not knowing what the parents should be when implementing HTMX than necessarily HTMX being a bad tool for the job. Because at the end of the day, we should use what we are comfortable with, we should use the tools that we already know and that can help us be more productive. Even if somewhere on the internet we read that HTMX is a brand new tool that can help solve all of our problems, if we give HTMX a try and we don't feel like we are becoming more productive, then it may be a better solution to just stick with what we already know tools like, let's say, React or next.js. That said, we're always open to reevaluating our tech stack as our needs evolve and new technologies emerge. Who knows what the future might bring? So this is it. While I disagree with a lot of points that were made during this article, I still enjoyed the article very much, and I think it is very nice of the Gumroad's team to publish a article on the htmx.org website, and it creates sort of a nice bridge between both of these ecosystems and between both of these ways of building web applications. And I think that's always nice. It is nice to sort of look at these things as tools that we can use to build web applications and not feel so stuck to one particular solution and sort of try different things all of the time. So with this being said, I'm also going to leave a link to the article in the description down below if you want to check it, and I'll see you on the next video.